The neon lights of Station 7's lowest-level bar painted everything in shades of blue and red. Lissa Drake's silver scales shimmed under the harsh lighting as she watched her target through narrowed eyes. The human sat at the counter, his casual posture hiding something she couldn't quite figure out. James Miller. That was his name, according to the station's records. A simple mechanic, or so his papers claimed. But Lisa hadn't become the most successful Centaurian bounty hunter in the Outer Rim by taking things at face value. She lifted her drink, pretending to sip while studying his movements. For someone in a bar full of aliens, many of whom were giving him unfriendly looks, he seemed too relaxed. Most humans in this part of space stayed alert, nervous. Not this one. "Another round for my friends here," James called out to the bartender, gesturing to a group of grumbling Martian miners. The red-skinned aliens had been glaring at him for the past hour, but his generous offer made them pause. Soon, they were raising their glasses to him, their earlier hostility forgotten. Lisa's tail twitched with interest. Clever. He'd turned potential enemies into allies with a simple gesture. But why would a mere mechanic need such skills? Her computer pad buzzed quietly. The deep background check she'd been running had finished. As her eyes scanned the results, her silver scales rippled with excitement. James Miller had appeared out of nowhere 3 years ago, but there were patterns in his movements. Every station he visited had one thing in common. They all housed ruins of ancient technology. A warmth spread through her chest that had nothing to do with her drink. This wasn't just any human. This was exactly the kind of prize she'd been waiting for. "Interesting choice," the voice said, startling her from her thoughts. Lissa looked up to find James standing near her table, nodding at her drink. The Centaurian Frostfire. Not many non-Centaurians can handle it. She hadn't heard him approach. "Another point of interest. Most humans don't recognize it," she replied, studying his face up close for the first time. His eyes were a deep brown, carrying an intelligence that matched her suspicions. "I make it a point to learn about other cultures," he said, then gestured to the empty chair across from her. "Mind if I join you?" Lisa's heart raced. This was moving faster than she'd planned, but she kept her expression neutral. "Please do." As James sat down, she noticed the subtle way he positioned himself. Back to the wall, clear view of both exits. Not standard behavior for a simple mechanic. "I couldn't help but notice you've been watching me," he said, his tone friendly but his eyes sharp. "Usually I can guess why someone's interested in me, but you're a bit harder to read." Lisa let her scales shift to a warmer silver, a subtle sign of amusement that she knew most humans wouldn't catch. But James's eyes flickered to her scales, and the corner of his mouth twitched upward. He had caught it. "Perhaps I'm just curious about a human who drinks alone in alien bars," she said. "Perhaps," he agreed, "or perhaps you're curious about other things. Like why a mechanic visits so many ancient tech sites." Lisa's scales froze mid-ripple. He knew she'd been investigating him. And instead of running, he'd approached her. James smiled, and for the first time, Lisa felt like she might be the one walking into a trap rather than setting one. "I have a feeling," he said, "that we might have some interesting things to discuss, Captain Drake." She hadn't told him her name or rank. Her tail twitched again, but this time with something between excitement and concern. This human was going to be far more interesting than she'd initially thought. The hunt had just become much more complicated and much more intriguing. Over the next few days, Lisa found herself running into James in the most unexpected places around Station 7. At least, that's how it would have appeared to anyone watching. In reality, she had planned each encounter carefully, or so she thought. "Fancy meeting you here," James said as he looked up from a market stall displaying Centaurian artifacts. His smile suggested he knew these meetings weren't accidental at all. "Interested in your own cultural history, Captain?" Lisa's scales shifted to a lighter shade of silver, a sign of mild embarrassment that she quickly controlled. "These are poor copies," she said, picking up one of the ceremonial binding chains. "The real ones have much more intricate patterns." Like the ones your family has made for 3 generations? James asked casually, making Lisa's tail go rigid. That wasn't public information. The Drake family is quite famous among those who study Centaurian binding customs. She set down the fake chain, studying him with new intensity. You seem to know a lot about my people's traditions. I find them fascinating, he replied, moving to a different stall. This one sold tech parts, and his fingers moved over them with obvious expertise, especially how your hunting customs evolved into complex ritual partnerships. Lisa followed him, noting how he tested the weight of each part like someone who knew exactly what he was looking for. Most humans find our binding customs primitive or frightening. James laughed, the sound drawing looks from nearby shoppers. Most humans don't bother to understand that binding isn't about ownership. It's about mutual responsibility and trust. He held up a rare power coupling. Just like most people don't realize this cheap-looking part could power an ancient tech site. Her scales rippled with interest at both his cultural knowledge and his casual mention of ancient tech. You're a surprising human, James Miller. And you're a surprising hunter, Lisa Drake. He turned to face her fully. Most would have made their move by now. Yet here you are, having civil conversations about cultural customs. The market crowd moved around them, but Lisa barely noticed. She found herself drawn into his warm brown eyes, seeing intelligence and amusement there. Perhaps I'm enjoying the conversations. Perhaps, he agreed, then nodded toward a nearby cafe. Would you like to continue this one over a proper meal? I hear they serve excellent Centaurian frost cuisine. Lisa knew she should be maintaining professional distance. This was supposed to be a hunt, not a cultural exchange. Yet she found herself following him to the cafe, her tail swaying with interest rather than predatory focus. As they settled at a quiet corner table, James ordered in perfect Centaurian, his pronunciation flawless. The waiter's 4 eyes widened in surprise before hurrying off. You speak my language, Lisa said, not bothering to hide her amazement. I believe in thorough research, James replied, his eyes twinkling. Especially when I know I've caught the attention of someone interesting. Lisa's scales shimmered with a mix of emotions she couldn't quite sort out. This human had thoroughly disrupted her usual hunting patterns. She should have been frustrated, but instead found herself intrigued. You're making this very difficult, she admitted. Making what difficult? He asked innocently, but his smile said he knew exactly what she meant. My job. Ah. James leaned back as their food arrived. And what if I told you I could make your job easier, while also making it far more interesting? Lisa's tail curled with curiosity. I'm listening. Not yet, he said, gesturing to their meals. First, let's enjoy this excellent food. Then we can discuss how a willing partner might be more valuable than a captured prize. Lisa found herself speechless for the first time in years. This human wasn't just evading her hunt, he was transforming it into something else entirely. And the most surprising part was how much she looked forward to finding out exactly what that might be. The observation deck of Station 7 was empty at this late hour, the vast window showing nothing but endless stars and the soft blue glow of the nearby nebula. Lisa paced the length of the deck, her silver scales reflecting the starlight as she waited. She had finally decided to reveal everything to James, but now her tail twitched with unusual nervousness. The door slid open with a soft hiss. James walked in, right on time, carrying 2 cups of steaming liquid. Thought you might like some frostfire tea, he said, offering her one of the cups. It helps calm nervous scales. Lisa accepted the drink, noting how he'd once again demonstrated his knowledge of her species. You know why I asked you here? To finally tell me you're hunting me. He smiled, taking a sip from his own cup. Or to explain why you haven't captured me yet, despite having 3 perfect opportunities in the past week. Her scales rippled in surprise. You count it. The maintenance tunnel on level 3, the empty cargo bay, and the turbolift malfunction. He listed them casually. All excellent chances for a skilled hunter like yourself. Yet here I am, still free. Lisa set down her cup, her tail moving in slow, thoughtful patterns. You knew from the beginning, before you even approached me in the bar. I make it a point to know when I'm being hunted. James turned to face the stars. Just as I make it a point to know about Centaurian binding customs, especially those of the Drake family. Why? Lisa moved closer, her hunter's instincts still trying to understand this unusual prey. James pulled something from his pocket, a small, intricately carved piece of silver metal that made Lisa's scales flash with recognition. Because when I found this in an ancient tech site 3 years ago, I knew I needed to understand everything about your people. That's a Drake family binding chain. A real one. Lisa's voice was barely a whisper. It was lost centuries ago when my ancestors' ship disappeared near the Crimson Nebula, James finished, where I found the ruins of their ship, preserved in a pocket of stopped time, along with their research about how ancient technology and Centaurian binding customs are connected. Lisa's mind raced. Her family had always suspected their ancestors had discovered something important, but all records were lost with their ship. This is why you let me hunt you. Partially, James admitted. I needed to meet a Drake, to understand if the legends about your family were true. But I didn't expect. He paused, looking at her with those intelligent brown eyes. I didn't expect you. What did you expect? A traditional hunter, focused only on the capture. Instead, I found someone willing to learn, to talk, to understand. He held out the ancient chain. Someone who might be interested in more than just adding another prize to their collection. Lisa looked at the chain, then at James. You're proposing a partnership. Your ancestors discovered something incredible, James said. Something that connects your people's traditions with technology beyond our understanding. But they needed both species, human ingenuity and Centaurian binding customs, to make it work. And you think we could rediscover their work? Lisa's scales shimmered with excitement at the possibility. I think we could do more than that. James stepped closer. But it would require trust. Real trust, not just hunter and prey playing at civilization. Lisa's tail moved in a pattern of decision. Then let me show you real trust. She reached for her belt and pulled out her hunter's binding chain, the symbol of her profession and power. With deliberate movements, she placed it on the deck between them. James looked at the chain, then met her eyes with a smile. I accept your trust, he said, and raise you something more interesting. From his other pocket, he pulled out ancient technical schematics covered in Centaurian script. How about we discuss what your ancestors really discovered? Lisa's scales rippled with a mix of emotions she never felt before. This human had turned everything she knew about hunting upside down. And somehow, she couldn't wait to see what happened next. The ancient schematics spread across the table in Lisa's private quarters glowed faintly in the dim light. James traced the complex Centaurian symbols with his finger, while Lisa's tail moved in thoughtful patterns behind her. Your ancestors didn't just discover ancient technology, James explained, pointing to a particular set of markings. They found out that Centaurian binding rituals could activate it. The physical chains acted as power conductors, and the mental connection between hunter and bound amplified the energy. Lisa's scales shimmered with excitement. That's why our binding customs survived even after we became a spacefaring species. They weren't just tradition. They had real power. Exactly. James straightened up, his eyes bright with enthusiasm. But here's the interesting part. It only works with willing participants. Forced binding creates resistance that blocks the energy flow. Which is why you let me hunt you, Lisa said, understanding dawning in her eyes. You needed a hunter from my family, but you needed one who would choose partnership over capture. James smiled. I watched you for months before letting you find my trail. You were different from other hunters. You studied your targets, tried to understand them. You showed mercy when others wouldn't. Lisa's scales shifted to a deeper silver, their equivalent of a blush. And now you want us to form a proper binding. To access this technology. Yes, but on terms that respect both our cultures. James pulled out a small box from his jacket. Inside were 2 matching bracelets, made from the same material as the ancient chain they'd discussed earlier. I had these made based on your ancestors' designs. They're not just symbols, they're tools. Lisa picked up one of the bracelets, feeling a faint hum of energy from within it. You're suggesting something unprecedented. A human and a Centaurian, bound as equals. Scary, isn't it? James's eyes twinkled. The great hunter Lisa Drake, accepting a binding where she shares power instead of holding it all. And the clever James Miller, she countered, her tail moving playfully, agreeing to be bound when he could keep running. I propose these terms, James said, his voice becoming more formal. I accept your binding, acknowledging your skill as a hunter and your rights under Centaurian law. In return, you accept that I am a willing partner, not a captured prize, with equal say in our endeavors. Lisa's scales rippled with approval. You really did study our customs. That's almost perfectly worded. She lifted one bracelet. I would add, we bind ourselves to the pursuit of knowledge left by my ancestors, sharing both the dangers and discoveries equally. Agreed. James took the other bracelet. And one more thing. Either of us can end the binding at any time. Trust has to be continuous, not just a one-time choice. Lisa's tail moved in a pattern of agreement. The council won't like this. It goes against centuries of tradition. Good thing you Drakes have a history of breaking tradition when it matters. James held up his bracelet. Should we make history? Lisa stood, her full height impressive even for a Centaurian. She began the traditional binding words, but with a subtle difference. I, Lisa Drake, choose to bind myself to this partner, as he binds himself to me. Equal in trust, equal in purpose. James responded with perfect Centaurian pronunciation. I, James Miller, accept this binding freely, offering trust to match trust, purpose to match purpose. They clasped the bracelets on each other's wrists. The ancient metal hummed with energy. And for a moment, both of them felt a connection that went beyond physical bonds. Well, James said, flexing his wrist as the bracelet settled, shall we go make your ancestors proud? Lisa's scales glowed with a happiness she hadn't expected to feel. Let's show the galaxy what a real partnership looks like. The ruins on planet X-227 stretched across the barren landscape like the bones of a forgotten giant. Lisa's ship, the Silver Hunter, sat 100 meters away, its sleek form a stark contrast to the ancient structures around it. The energy readings are stronger here, James said, checking his modified scanner. The device incorporated parts of an old Centaurian binding chain, allowing it to detect the unique energy signatures they sought. His binding bracelet hummed softly in response to the surroundings. Lisa moved ahead, her tail helping her balance on the uneven ground. Her scales had taken on a protective dark silver coloring, better suited for the planet's harsh sunlight. My ancestors' records mentioned this place. They called it the Gateway. Gateway to what? James carefully stepped over a fallen column, his boots raising small clouds of red dust. Before Lisa could answer, the ground trembled. A section of the ruins before them began to sink, revealing a dark passage below. Both their binding bracelets pulsed with energy. I guess we're about to find out, Lisa said, her hunter's instincts on high alert. She reached for her plasma rifle, but James caught her arm. Wait, he said, pulling out the ancient chain they'd found earlier. Remember the schematics. Weapons disrupt the energy patterns. We need to rely on the binding technology. Lisa's tail twitched with uncertainty. You're asking a hunter to go in unarmed. No, James smiled, holding up his bracelet. I'm asking you to trust in a different kind of weapon. One your ancestors created. As if responding to his words, both their bracelets glowed brighter. Lisa felt the familiar warmth of their binding connection strengthen. Fine. But if we die, I'm blaming you in the afterlife. Deal. James led the way into the passage, the chain in his hands giving off a soft blue light that illuminated their path. The tunnel walls were covered in a mix of ancient writing and Centaurian script. Lisa's scales rippled with excitement as she recognized some of the symbols from her family's records. James, look. These are the same markings that were on the schematics. They're not just markings, James said, his voice filled with wonder. He pressed his hand against one of the symbols, and their binding bracelets pulsed in unison. The walls began to hum with energy. Suddenly, the tunnel ahead lit up, revealing a vast chamber. In its center stood a pillar of swirling energy, contained within what looked like crystalline branches. "A heart of the gateway," Lisa whispered, remembering fragments of her family's stories. The legends say it could bridge not just space, but time itself. James stepped closer to the pillar, the ancient chain in his hands resonating with its energy. "Your ancestors found this place, but couldn't fully activate it. They needed a willing binding," Lisa finished. "A true partnership between species." Their bracelets pulsed again, stronger this time. The pillar's energy reached out toward them like curious tendrils of light. "Ready to make history?" James asked, holding out his hand. Lisa took it, their binding bracelets touching. Together, the energy from the pillar enveloped them both. Lisa felt their binding connection grow stronger than ever, not just between them, but somehow reaching across time itself. For a moment, she sensed the presence of her ancestors, their approval of this unprecedented partnership. When the light faded, the pillar had changed. What was once chaotic energy now flowed in controlled patterns, responding to their combined presence. "It worked," James said softly, checking his scanner. "The gateway is active." Lisa's scales shimmered with pride and excitement. "So, partner, where should we explore first?" James grinned, squeezing her hand. "Everywhere. News travels fast in space." By the time Lisa and James returned to Station 7, word of their unique binding had spread through the Centaurian hunting community. They found the station's main hall crowded with silver-scaled hunters, all waiting for them. "Well, this isn't good," James muttered as they stepped off their ship. His binding bracelet hummed with nervous energy that matched Lisa's twitching tail. A large Centaurian stepped forward from the crowd. His scales were deep gray, marked with the prestigious patterns of the High Hunting Council. "Lisa Drake," his voice boomed across the hall. "You dare mock our traditions with this arrangement?" Lisa moved slightly in front of James, her scales shifting to a defensive pattern. Council leader read, "I follow our most ancient traditions, the ones that predate even your authority. By binding yourself to a human." Red's tail lashed in anger. "He cannot possibly understand our ways." James stepped forward, matching Lisa's stance. "Actually," he said in perfect Centaurian, making the crowd murmur in surprise, "I challenge that assumption under the rights of the bound." Section 7, Paragraph 3. "Any bound who proves worthy may defend their binding before the council." The crowd fell silent. Lisa's scales rippled with pride and amusement. Trust James to know their laws better than most hunters. Red's scales darkened with rage. "You dare quote our laws?" "I dare to respect them," James replied calmly. "I invoke the trial of worth. Let me prove this binding serves both our peoples." Lisa turned to him in surprise. The trial of worth was an ancient and dangerous tradition. Few bound had ever attempted it, and fewer had survived. Red laughed, the sound echoing off the station's metal walls. "Very well, human. 3 tests: strength, wisdom, and unity. Fail any one, and the binding is broken. Fail badly." His tail moved in a pattern that made several hunters step back, and you might not survive to regret it. "We accept," James said before Lisa could protest. He turned to her with a confident smile. "Trust me." Lisa's scales shifted through several colors before settling on a determined silver. "Always, partner." The first test came without warning. Red's tail whipped out, launching a binding chain straight at James's throat. But instead of dodging, James caught the chain with his bracelet hand. The ancient metal glowed, and the chain went limp. First lesson of Centaurian hunting: James said, letting the chain fall. Never attack one who understands the binding metals. Red's scales paled slightly. The wisdom test, then. Answer this. Why do we bind? A trick question, James replied. The real wisdom is knowing that the answer changes. Once it was for control, then for tradition. But originally, he held up his bracelet. It was for partnership, to connect two beings in pursuit of something greater than themselves. Lisa felt their binding pulse with approval, and she saw several younger hunters nodding thoughtfully. The unity test remains, Red growled. Prove your binding serves our people. James smiled and pulled out the ancient chain they'd found. This belonged to the first Drake hunters. With its help, and our binding, we've rediscovered what your ancestors knew. That true partnership unlocks powers beyond simple capture and control. The chain glowed, responding to their binding bracelets. Around them, every binding chain and bracelet in the hall began to shimmer with the same ancient energy. Impossible, Red whispered, his own chain resonating. No, Lisa said, taking James's hand. Simply forgotten. Our binding doesn't weaken Centaurian traditions. It returns them to their original purpose. To connect, to grow, to discover. The energy faded, but the effect remained. The younger hunters looked at their chains with new wonder, while the older ones whispered among themselves. Red scales shifted through several patterns before settling on a formal gray. The trial of worth is complete. The binding stands. As the crowd dispersed, James turned to Lisa. That went well. Lisa's tail swatted him playfully. Next time, maybe warn me before invoking ancient trials. Where's the fun in that? James grinned. Besides, now no one can challenge what we've started. Lisa looked at the departing hunters, many of them discussing what they'd seen. No, she said thoughtfully. I think we've just started something much bigger. 6 months after the trial of Worth, Station 7's observation deck looked very different. Where once it had been empty, now it hosted a gathering of humans and Centaurians, all wearing variations of binding bracelets that glowed softly in the starlight. Lisa stood at the window, her scales shimmering with pride as she watched a young human engineer demonstrating ancient technology to an eager group of Centaurian hunters. Her tail moved in peaceful patterns as James joined her. Remember when you were planning to chain me up and add me to your collection? He asked, bumping his shoulder against hers playfully. Remember when you pretended to be just a simple mechanic? She countered, her scales rippling with amusement. Their binding bracelets hummed in harmony with their shared joke. Look at them, James said, gesturing to the mixed group. 3 new partnerships formed this week alone. The council can barely keep up with the applications. Lisa nodded. After their challenge with Red, everything had changed. Young hunters especially had embraced the idea of willing partnerships, seeking out humans with knowledge or skills that complemented their own. The Gateway expedition leaves tomorrow, Lisa said, watching a pair of newly bound partners practicing with their bracelets. First official joint mission between our species. Nervous about leading it? James asked, though their binding let him feel her excitement rather than anxiety. More like eager. The Gateway showed us so much, but it's just the beginning. Her scales shifted to a bright, enthusiastic silver. My ancestors would be proud to see their discoveries bringing our peoples together like this. A soft chime interrupted them. The observation deck's main screen lit up with a transmission from the High Hunting Council. Red's familiar face appeared, his scales now bearing additional marks of even higher authority. Attention all bound pairs. His voice carried the formal tones of official business, but without the hostility from 6 months ago. The Council has completed its review of the ancient records provided by the Drake-Miller Partnership. We hereby recognize the original binding protocols as valid and binding law. A cheer went up from the gathered crowd. Lisa felt James's hand slip into hers as Red continued. Furthermore, we established the Joint Exploration Division, dedicated to the discovery and understanding of ancient technologies through human-Centaurian partnerships. Captain Drake, Engineer Miller. The council requests your leadership in this endeavor. Lisa's tail moved in happy surprise as James squeezed her hand. Their binding bracelets glowed brighter, reflecting their shared joy. Looks like we're going to be busy, James said after Red's transmission ended. Ready for a new adventure? Always, Lisa replied. Though I'm still amazed how this all started. I really thought I was the hunter and you were the prey. James laughed. In a way, we both were. You were hunting me, while you were hunting for the right partner to unlock the ancient mysteries. Lisa finished. Their binding hummed with the truth of it. Around them, the gathered pairs began to disperse, heading off to their own adventures and discoveries. Some would join tomorrow's Gateway expedition, others would explore different ruins, and some would forge new paths entirely. You know, James said thoughtfully, I never did tell you what made me choose you specifically. Out of all the Drake hunters, why I let you find my trail. Lisa's scales shifted with curiosity. Why did you? He turned to face her fully, his brown eyes warm with affection. Because when I researched you, I found something unique. Every capture in your record had the same note, treated with respect and dignity. You didn't just hunt, you tried to understand. That's when I knew you were different. Lisa's scales rippled with emotion as their binding pulsed warmly. And now look at us, leading a revolution in how our peoples interact. Speaking of leading, James grinned, pulling out their old scanner, now modified with their latest discoveries. Want to see what I found in the ancient maps? There's a site in the Orion Nebula that matches the Gateway's energy signature. Lisa's tail moved in an excited pattern. New mysteries to solve. New adventures to share, he corrected, holding out his hand. She took it without hesitation, their binding bracelets glowing in the starlight. Where once she had planned to chain him, now they were bound together by something far stronger. Trust, partnership, and the promise of endless discoveries to come. Let's go make history, they said together, and the stars seemed to shine a little brighter in response.